everyone.
No, go ahead.
No, you go. I just wanted to say good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this second installment of the HOTMA and 811 PRA program training. Justin Merrill is going to be our presenter today. I will be putting resources in the chat as necessary and responding or reading aloud questions that are asked in the questions box. If you need closed captioning, that's down at the bottom of your go-to platform. The handouts were emailed out yesterday, but if you registered late or missed that email, they are available to you at the top. There's a little sheet of paper with a paper clip, and that's where the materials will be listed. You will not hear from me much today unless questions are asked, and I read those out loud because Justin is going to take it from here. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Kara, for that introduction. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the training. So we are talking about the 811 PRA program today. If you need to reach the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, we have a mailing address and a physical address. We also have a website. I recommend, if you haven't visited our website, to give it a check out because a lot of good information is there, such as information about our rules and requirements, upcoming trainings, and also access to different things to submit utility allowances and all that good stuff. If you need to reach us, we have a division telephone number. You can call us at that number. We also have a 1-800 number, which is toll-free in Texas, if you need to get a hold of us to ask us questions. If it's just general questions, please feel free to send an email to that email address, just general questions about the different programs. If you have a specific question about a monitoring review, you do need to email the monitor that issued the letter so that they can help you with that specific question, just because they are the ones who did the review and they know what is going on. If you email me asking me about somebody else's review, I have no idea what's going on. So I won't be able to give you good information. So I'll send you back to them. We do need to discuss our schedule. We do have planned for us today from being from 9 to 12. I don't know if it's going to take that long. We are going to be talking about certifications today, but except for the annual recertification, which will be next week, we are going to be going over some examples from the HUD guidance regarding HOTMA, specifically and how that would impact 811 PRA. So those examples might take us a little bit longer. And I do want to point out that our examples are not more specific than the ones that they've given us, because this is a new process and we're learning together. We will be taking a break if the training does run longer. And like Kara said earlier, she's going to be on hand to be fielding any questions that you may have. Please put them in the chat box. If you have any of those questions, that way it will track your questions. And if we are able to ask them during the presentation, we will so. And if we don't get them during the presentation, then we will reach back out to you after the presentation. For housekeeping, it's important that you note that the person who signed up for the training today will be receiving an email that they did attend today's training. It is not a form of continuing education. It's just, hey, you did attend the training. This is more of a small snapshot training, so it's not a certificate of continuing education. It's just participation. If you do not get it within about 24 hours, that email, please do check your junk email box just to make sure that it didn't go there. And we do recommend that you do try to silence any distractions such as cell phones or emails during the presentation, just so you can give us your focus. That way you don't miss out on something. I know sometimes you know something that we were already talking about, and so you don't pay attention because you get distracted. And then I say something that you did not know, and then you're like, oh my gosh, what did he say? So just give us all your attention if you can. I know it's hard. We do try to make these smaller trainings. That way it can, you have a little more time to do other things in your day. You do have some handouts, like Kara said. It's the little, in the GoToWebinar, it is the little piece of paper with the paper clip. We have today's presentation there. We also have the HOTMA final rule and the updated HUD Notice 2310, which is where most of our information comes. and the HUD Notice 2025-03. So let's talk about move-in, interim, and other non-interim certifications. So for your move-in certifications and your initial certifications for the 811 PRA program, and as a recap, a move-in certification is for 811 is specifically when you have a household or a family that is moving into your unit and they did not live at your property previously. So they are brand new to your property. An initial certification is a certification where they are already tenants of yours and they left the program and now they are re-entering the program. And there's several reasons why they may be re-entering the program. It could be they graduated from the program because they had income that was caused them not to have any rental assistance. It could be that they failed to recertify. But whatever reason that was causing them to leave the program or the reason why they left the program is no longer the case, they can re-enter the program. So for those two types of certifications, the HOTMA guidance is not changing the way you do it. So you're going to continue to do it the way that you've always done. You are going to use anticipated income for the upcoming 12 months. So you will do just like you do normally. You're going to look at what is based on what they put in their application, the verifications that you've obtained. What is that income going to look like for the next 12 months? This is exactly how we are doing it for our other programs. This is exactly how you've been doing so far. There's been no change in the way that works. Interim certifications are also going to be done similarly, where you are anticipating the upcoming 12 months, just like you currently are doing now. The major change that has happened for interim certifications for 811 PRA under HOTMA is that HUD has specifically defined the timeline for reasonable timeline. So what is reasonable timeline? So when a tenant tells you that they've had a change in their adjusted income, or you discover on an EIV report or from other source that they have had a change, but they have not reported to you like they're required to, you are required to process an interim recertification if a threshold is met to trigger that interim recertification. That timeline has been kind of loose, and HUD has now defined it to be approximately 30 days from when you've become aware of that change, either from the tenant telling you, the family telling you, or that you've discovered in a report. So we are going to start providing technical assistance in the upcoming year that if you are not meeting this timeline, that you should need to start meeting those timelines approximately within 30 days. Otherwise, going forward, we will begin to start citing findings of noncompliance. It also changes, make some tweaks to when you have to conduct the interim recertifications and when you process them and then become effective. So that has been tweaked a little bit. So we will talk about what are the triggers for the thresholds for the interim recertifications. And then the interim recertifications play a factor into when you're doing your annual recertification. So we won't talk about annual recertifications today, but we will touch upon because they can go up almost to when the annual recertifications are due. So in your written policies and procedures, your tenant selection plan, your administrative plan, your EIV policy, just like we said last week, it's very important that you have in your written policy and procedures how you're going to be processing certifications. It's very important for you to indicate in your written policies and procedures that you have a policy on that your tenants are required to report any change of adjusted income to the on-site staff so that they can make the determination of whether or not an interim recertification is required because a threshold has been met. And so it's important that your policy writes that out. It needs to be clear on what you're going to be doing. And today we're going to be talking about what those thresholds are, and that will help you kind of understand what your policy needs to say. You need to also, HOTMA very clearly indicated to us participating in the 811 PRA program that it is not just what they have reported to you, the family has reported to you as a change to trigger an interim recertification, but any other change that they have had. So if you are screening your household and you determine that they have come to you and said, hey, I have a new job, or I'm sorry, that's a bad example. If someone says, hey, I have child support that I'm now getting, and that is meeting the threshold in order for me to report that to you, you would need to screen the household with some type of screening application or questionnaire that would ask if there's any other changes that have occurred. So you can either use the current application that you use at the other certifications, the move-in and initial and annual, or you can have a special application or questionnaire that specifically says, hey, of all these things, has any of this changed? That's okay. So you can either use the normal one you have. Some of our housing partners use a specific application for this process, and that's okay. But you do need to make sure that however you are screening them, that you are screening them to consider any changes that may happen. So if we receive a complaint that they reported that they had a second change and you did not take that consideration in, that would be a potential finding of noncompliance because you have to consider everything that has happened. So an example would be that if a family tells you they've had a decrease in their annual adjusted income that meets the new threshold of 10%, and the screening indicate that they also have had a change in asset, you would need to verify the assets and the income change. And then that would be part of your certification process. So in the past, many housing partners were already doing this, but some of them were really zeroing in on the changes. But you do need to screen them as a key component to ensure that you are capturing all of those changes. You do need to maintain in the tenant files documentation to evidence any attempted interim recertifications. So I know that for other housing programs, multifamily programs monitored by the department, that it is very common that you've had drafts of documentations, not verifications, because we want to see the verifications you've obtained, but if you've had drafts of like an income certification and you're filling it out and it looks awful, you start over, and then that final version is what you have the tenant execute. This program is not like that. This program wants you to document any of previous income certifications, such as a 5059 or 5059A, and any of the corrected certifications. In addition, through HOTMA, HUD is now saying that there is a higher threshold that is necessary in order for tenants to trigger an interim recertification, which in theory should reduce the number of interim recertifications that you need to conduct in between your annual recertifications. However, the trade-off to that is that you do need to track any attempted interim recertifications. So if a family comes to you and tells you, hey, I've had a change in income, annual adjusted income, and I need to conduct an interim recertification, you need to go through the process that you have in your written policy and procedure. You need to have them complete an application. You need to verify the changes. You need to complete a certification. Now, what will happen is that if you have an interim recertification that you're going to attempt, but you go through the process and you determine that they didn't meet the threshold, you're not going to complete a 5059 in order to complete the process, but you do need to have some type of note to file on top of that documentation showing us in the file when we ask for it that you did have an attempt into interim recertifications, and you need to document your calculations as to why they did not meet the threshold. So HUD does have on their website training for conducting certifications for 811 PRA. I recommend that you go and check that out. In those trainings, there was a contractor with HUD that did provide some documentations and some forms, kind of giving you what you could use as a cover letter. In previous HOTMA trainings, I provided a copy of those. Kara's probably wondering what I'm talking about. So during the break, I'll probably drop a link to that because I didn't give her a heads up on that. But that would be a great use of documents. And that form is basically where it says, hey, they came in, this is what the threshold amount would be in the change. So it's basically looking at their current annual adjusted income and then says, this is what the difference is, and this is why I didn't meet the threshold. You will find out later in today's training why it's very important for you to document failed attempted interim recertifications, because it may still trigger one later on. Keeping that the documentation is important, because what will happen is if this current notice to you of a potential change does not trigger an interim recertification, a combined change over the course of the year between annual recertifications may be enough to trigger it. So one interim certification attempt may not be sufficient, but if the second time they come in, it tells you that they have met the threshold by combining the first one to the second one, that would trigger an interim recertification. So it is cumulative, where it means that that percentage from before's a failed attempt plus this one would now cause that. So an example, if you have a family that reports a 5% change in March, and that change is not sufficient enough to trigger an interim recertification because it's a 10% trigger, a threshold, if the family then comes in later in the year in June, and now they have an additional 6% change, the combined changes from both March and June would equal 11%, and in June, that would trigger an interim recertification. So this is a big change from what we were doing before. If someone came in that was a $200 difference up or down, but now it is a 10% threshold, and that threshold can be cumulative. So I cannot emphasize enough, this is a major change, and you need to document your files if you have an interim certification that does not trigger an interim recertification. So what we would expect to see when we do a review for the 811 program is such as during our rent review, if we give you a period of scope, and during that period of scope, you have an interim recertification that did not trigger the certification, and you had one that did, we need to see all of the documentation, even for interim recertifications that didn't actually result in any executed 5059. So again, keep those interim recertifications. And the thing about HOTMA is it is introducing a new type of interim recertification. And so we'll talk about what that is. It is called a non-interim recertification or an other non-interim recertification. The language kind of changes throughout. I think HUD was trying to nail down what was the name of it that they were going to call it. But on your 5059, you're going to see it be listed as, I believe, as other non-interim recertification. So interim recertifications in general, old and new. We're going to talk about both types, and then we'll talk about what the differences are. So let's talk about if the family has reported a decrease in adjusted income. If a family comes in and they want to tell you, hey, I've had a change in my annual adjusted income, I'm letting you know about that. They can request, and you should document your tenant file that they have made the request. It is your job to also document whether or not that actually resulted in an interim recertification or not. If they have had a change of less than 10% going down of the family's annual adjusted income, you can deny them the interim recertification. So you would still have them complete the application process. You would still verify documentation, but then you would have some type of document or form letter on top of that, or note to file that's saying, hey, this is what their annual adjusted income was. This is the value of that new income. That is not more than a 10% change. Therefore, per our written policies and procedures, we are not conducting an interim recertification. We are saving this documentation so that if the threshold is potentially met later, that we would then trigger one and conduct it at that time. So what is permitted under the program? HUD has said that if a owner of a property, so if you are representing an owner or you are the owner for the 811 PRA, the program uses the term owner to represent pretty much that entire group. So if the owner sets up written policy and procedure to have a lower threshold to not have 10%, but maybe say that the threshold to trigger an interim recertification is 5%, the owner has the right to do that. So You don't have to do this. So HUD says that if your written policy and procedures say that the threshold is 10%, a decrease of 10% or more, then that would trigger an interim recertification. Then you just need to document that it doesn't meet the threshold. However, if the owner elects to do a lower threshold, then you would have to follow that threshold and be fair and consistent in the implementation of that. So for example, you could say the threshold is now 5%. So if they have had a 5% change in their annual adjusted income, that would trigger an interim recertification at the property. There's no requirement to do this. Most housing partners, I imagine, are not going to do this simply because a lot of housing partners have tenants that have a lot of interim recertifications that occur between their annual recertifications. And one of HOTMA's goals is to reduce the administrative burden on all parties. And so by sending the 10% threshold, that is reducing the number of interim recertifications. If there is documentation, you go through the process, the family comes in and they indicate that they've had a change, you screen them, you verify, you document that it did meet the 10% threshold through your calculations. If it meets or exceeds the 10% change, you must conduct an interim recertification. So it is required if it is over 10%, but if it is less than 10% of a decrease in annual adjusted income, you do not. The HOTMA is very clear, and I think that the reason why they were very clear is because that has been the policy so far up to this point, is that we have had a threshold that was in dollar amounts. So up until HOTMA goes into effect, the threshold is more than a $200 difference. And that $200 difference is no longer permitted. In your written policies and procedures, it must be a 10% or whatever percentage-wise of the annual adjusted income that you have established, and you must follow that. Your policy cannot establish it to be a dollar amount instead of a percentage amount. So if you have, there is a decrease in family size attributed to the death or permanent move out of a family member, and removing that family member and their income results in a decrease in adjusted income, HUD is saying that you still need to process an interim recertification. So it's not just that 10% threshold. They've established a 0% threshold in this very specific circumstance. So they want to see any change like that so that they can account for it. Let's talk about some of the examples of what HUD has said for HOTMA and how it impacts 811 PRA. So I am going to read the examples. I know that's kind of like faux pas for trainings, but I want to make sure that I'm specifically stating what is there. This is directly coming from the HUD notice guidance, the updated guidance for HOTMA. And we're reading through them because nobody has implemented HOTMA for 811 yet. And so I don't have any examples to give you. So these are the examples we're going to use, and then I'm going to talk about them. There are a couple of things that you need to note is that in these examples, there are some examples where the owner has elected to do something more restrictive than required. And the other thing you need to note in our examples is that HUD wrote this not only for you who are an owner, a multifamily housing owner or MFH owner, but also for public housing authorities. So oftentimes it will refer to PHA/MFH owner. And what that means when you see that is that means you're the owner of the property or you're representing the owner. So in scenario A, you have a family with an annual adjusted income of $9,600, experiences a change in a household composition and becomes eligible for 2 dependent deductions totaling $960, resulting in a 10% decrease in the family's adjusted income. The $960 decrease in the family's adjusted income would require an interim recertification because the income decrease meets the 10% threshold for an interim recertification. So let's talk this through. Why is this happening? Well, first thing you need to note is that this guidance was published in 2020 or for 2024. And so the dependent deductions are going to adjust in January 2026. And so those numbers are not correct for us now in the future, but back then the 960 made sense. So let's talk about this. If you have a family who has an annual adjusted income of $9,600 and they have had a change in their household member, which means they added 2 dependents, which now qualifies them for 2 dependent deduction, because their annual adjusted income is so low, that dependent deduction is enough to trigger more than a 10% change in their family adjusted income. And as a result, because they met the threshold, you would be required to do an interim recertification. You would be required to screen them, verify any changes that has occurred, and then you're going to execute a 5059 doing a regular interim recertification. The next scenario we have is where a family experiences an increase in deductible child care expenses from 0 to 12,000 annually. Before the change, their annual adjusted income was $40,000. Since the child care expense deduction results in a greater than 10% reduction in annual adjusted income, an interim reexamination is required. So again, we have a family who has an annual adjusted income, and because of the child care expenses being quite significant, going from nothing to $12,000, that $40,000 is impacted because the 12,000 exceeds the 10% threshold of a decrease. So keep in mind that it is not just increases in annual income that can trigger a 10% change, or decreases in annual income. It can also be increases in deductions. So you got to remember, we have those 2 levers that help determine rent, and one of them is income that goes down could potentially trigger this, but it could also be the deductions going up that could trigger the 10% decrease. So keep that in mind when you're looking and you're doing the verifications. Your screening documentation must not just ask about changes in income sources, but also about deduction changes. So don't forget to keep that in mind. Kara, I feel like I've talked for a little while. We got a couple more examples, but I want to double check to see that we don't have any pressing questions.
We don't. We had a question about the 10% threshold, but then you immediately started talking about that with more detail. So we're good there.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara. I appreciate that. And thank you for asking your question. Obviously, you were thinking at it at the right time, and then I started talking about it. So good. You're right on the ball. You had your coffee. Let's talk about scenario C. Oh, go ahead, Kara.
I want to note that you and I do not have the same hairstyle, but the new cameras cause a real problem with the hair.
Oh, yeah.
Just FYI, I did not shave my head.
Oh, well, you know what? You would look good with a shaved head anyways.
I've always thought so, Justin. Thank you for validating that.
Yeah, you could totally pull off the Sinead O'Connor look.
In my next life, I will do it.
Excellent, excellent. So, well, everyone will just have to.
We do have a question.
Oh, good.
Okay, and this goes with what your examples are.
Okay.
If a resident does not inform us about new income until recert, do we do an interim first and then a recert?
That is a great question, and we're going to talk about it later. HUD has revised the guidance on when you can implement those changes. I don't want to talk about it right now, but I'm 100% certain that when we talk about it later in the training, it will answer your question, because HUD did take this into consideration, because we do have some families that misunderstand the program or forget to tell you. Any other questions? Okay, excellent. Let's talk about scenario C. So in this one, I just want to point out that this is where the owner of a property has elected a policy that is a percentage that is lower than what is required. So their percentage is required under HOTMA to be 10%, but in this scenario, they've elected a 5%. Now that is optional. The HUD requires for HOTMA a 10% decrease threshold. And so this owner has elected to do a lower one, and they put it in their written policy and procedures. So keep that in mind when we talk about this scenario. So a family has an adjusted annual income of $9,600, and they add a dependent family member with no income. So there is no increase in the income, but there is also an increase in the dependent deduction. So keep that in mind. So you need to think about that. This would result in an adjusted income decrease of $480 due to the dependent deduction. So because the dependent deduction has gone up, the annual adjusted income has gone down because those deductions reduce the annual adjusted income from the annual income. And because this decrease does not meet the 10% threshold of the family's annual adjusted income, and because this is a family member joining the assisted unit as opposed to a decrease of family size, the owner is not required to conduct an interim recertification. So most housing partners would stop there. You would say, hey, I did the screening, I did the verifying, I have a cover letter that shows my calculations and how this was what the 10% threshold was. This is what the change has resulted in. It doesn't meet that threshold. That is going to be where you would stop, and you would document that threshold wasn't met, and you would document it because later in the year you could have a scenario where it does meet it because you combine them. But for in this example, you would stop. However, this owner in this example has adopted a policy that says that they decrease the threshold from the 10% required under HOTMA to a 5% change. So they have a lower threshold. And so therefore the decrease meets their threshold in their policy, and they would be required to conduct an interim recertification. So as a reminder, you do not have to have anything than a 10% threshold for decreases in adjusted income, but you can if that is what you put in your written policies and procedures and you consistently implement. Let's talk about another example. In scenario D, we have a family who moved out of the assisted unit. The family's adjusted income prior to the change in the, I'm sorry, let me start again. A family member has moved out of the unit. Okay, so you still have the family living there, but one of the members have moved out. The family's adjusted income prior to the change in household composition was $20,000, but that number decreases to $18,000 when the family member moved out. So that means that they were contributing to that. Since HUD requires that owners process decreases in adjusted income greater than a 0% due to decreases in family size, you must process an interim recertification. So even though the 10% threshold wasn't met, because someone permanently moved out and that caused a change, you are going to be required to process the interim recertification. And you don't have to process the income, you're just processing the move out. So I know that's kind of a weird thing, but that is what HUD wants. And you will see once we start to talk about the other scenarios of other non-interim recertifications, you'll kind of understand that basically HUD is now going to a model of anytime there's going to be a major change to the family, whether it's the composition or the income or rent, they're going to want to know about that change. And so other non-interim recertifications are going to capture the other parts that aren't captured in a normal interim recertification. Scenario E. So we have a family member who moves into an assisted unit who receives $20,000 in pension income, which is more than a 10% of the household's adjusted income. At the same time, the head of household got a new job that increases the household's income by $15,000 per year. The owner will process the increase in pension income due to the new household member, but will not include the head of household's increase in earned income until the next annual recertification. So this example kind of gets ahead of what is the reverse threshold, which is the 10% increase. But the 10% increase is going to be only for unearned income. So HUD is saying that if there's an increase of more than 10%, it has to be unearned income, Social Security, child support, pension, that kind of thing. Those are the things that would trigger an interim recertification, but earned income does not trigger interim recertifications. And so you would wait until the annual recertification to include that. So HUD is giving an example here where they are saying a little bit in advance, because they haven't talked about the other threshold yet, is that basically what has happened is that you are going to process an interim recertification. You can gather the paperwork for the whole family to see if there's been any change in not just the new person, but any changes for people who are currently living there. So again, you got to screen the family to see if there's been any change whatsoever. And it is your job to review your written policies and procedures and make sure you follow them, which says that the threshold is being met not because they had a new person move in, although you would still need to report that. You do need to make sure that you add them to the 5059, but you're not going to process the person who lives there's increase in job income, because that is earned income and that doesn't happen at interim recertifications. Let's talk a little bit more. So the increases in adjusted income. So we talked about decreases, and that example segues us into increases on adjusted income. So if you become aware, either the family has notified you, or you see on some type of EIV report, or you heard through the Vine, or you shop at the supermarket and you see that they have a job, those are the kind of things that potentially is you becoming aware. And so if you become aware that they have had an increase of adjusted income of more than 10%, the threshold, then you'd be required to conduct an interim recertification. So previously, the threshold was 10% decrease. Now we're talking about 10% increase. So like I just said in the example, HUD is specifically saying that earned income, unless you put in well, let's talk about that in a second. HUD is saying that earned income increases do not trigger interim recertifications. So that is and can be your written policy. You can say in your written policy, hey, it is our policy that we do not consider earned income. We will look at that documentation. We will screen you for it when you tell us about any changes, but we may deny you the interim recertification because we've determined that when we look at all the changes, although you reported it, we are not considering any change in earned income between annual recertifications. Now, HOTMA also allows for you to establish a policy if you wish to do so. This is optional and elective. So a property's policy can also say, under a very specific set of scenarios, that you will process a change and increase in earned income, but only if there has been a decrease in earned income at an interim recertification that happened prior to the last annual recertification. So if you have 2 annual recertifications, you have 1 year and then the next year, and in between there, you have an interim recertification where they came in and they had a decrease in earned income. If it is your written policy and procedure to say later in the year, if the threshold is met because of earned income, where now the money went up because maybe they lost their job and got a new job, if that is your written policy and procedure, you would process an interim recertification under that scenario. If it is not in your written policy and procedure, you do not wish to implement it, your policy is just to say earned income does not trigger an increase in adjusted income triggering an interim recertification, then you don't have to do anything. You just process the decrease of 10% in earned income, but you would not process the earned income later on. So this is an election that you can make. So some PHAs and some owners may choose to do that. This is probably more likely going to be a PHA thing where they want to serve more people. And that's why they have this option that they can be able to have that also count. But if you do it, keep in mind, it is specifically if there was a decrease which triggered an interim recertification prior to that annual recertification. If you don't have an interim recertification that resulted in a decrease of more than 10%, then that trigger is not there. You cannot say in your policy that you will just process an interim recertification and income increase. You can also, in your policy, elect to conduct, not to conduct interim recertifications during the last 3 months prior to the due date for the next annual recertification. So this is not new, but HUD is definitely clarifying that this is still the case, where if you have in the last 3 months prior to an annual recertification being due, if your written policy and procedure says that you will not conduct an interim recertification, then you don't have to do so. So HUD is recognizing that, you know, you have to do the certification for the annual recertification. It doesn't make sense to process both an interim and an annual at the same time. So that's why it's in those last 3 months. So if a tenant comes into you and says, hey, I've had a 10% increase in annual adjusted income, and I would like you to conduct an interim recertification, and you could say, well, I just sent you your 90-day notice. We have 60 days before your next annual recertification. It is our written policy procedure. Here it is, that we're not going to process your interim recertification. We're going to roll it into your annual recertification. That's what you would do. So if you are a tenant, you just need to be aware that you should be reporting any changes, but you may be aware that you may be denied for an interim recertification under that scenario. Another thing is that HUD is expressly saying that if there is an increase that is less than 10%, you should not be processing an increase. You should not be processing an interim recertification. That is basically what HUD is saying. So it has to be the 10% threshold that is being processed. Just like with a 10% increase, that you do need to save your documentation for interim recertifications that do not actually meet the threshold, that fail to trigger an interim recertification. So what could happen is that if you have a interim recertification process that you go through, it doesn't result in interim recertification, but later in the year, another interim recertification is processed, and cumulatively together, the combined percentages does meet the threshold together, that would trigger an interim recertification. So what they're saying is that it is very important for anytime you start the interim recertification or the family requests an interim recertification, is that you are documenting the tenant files whether or not it met the threshold, because in both examples of going down and going up, cumulatively together, if the thresholds are met. So basically that 10% threshold is throughout the entire 9 months during the annual recertification prior to the processing of the next one. If you meet that combined, you would need to do an interim recertification. Okay, Kara, are there any questions? I know you're about to jump off, but.
Yes, there are several questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, with HOTMA, to clarify, does earned income decreasing by 10% threshold still require an interim recert?
Yes. So the earned income only does not trigger an interim recertification if there is an increase. If there is a decrease of more than 10% of earned income, that does trigger.
And then to make sure I understand, no interim recertification for increase of work income, but have to do an IR if 10% decrease in working income. I think that kind of goes with what you just answered.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. What if they moved in without income and started a job a few months after, and we found out during quarterly EIV reports? If we complete an IR, can it be an election as well?
So what happens is, we'll talk about later in the training what happens when tenants don't timely report, and what you should put in your policy and how you should follow it. But in general, if you become aware, you need to go through the process of processing the interim recertification. And if it doesn't meet the threshold, you need to document the file that it did not meet the threshold. So currently, right now, if you have someone who comes in and they tell you they have an interim recertification they haven't had a change, you go through the process. The biggest difference is that you're documenting the tenant files when you fail to meet the thresholds.
Okay. The next question is, so they are no longer required to report when an unemployed person becomes employed?
So they are required to report to you any change that they have, but you would document the file that is per your written policy and procedure, not triggering an interim recertification. So if someone moves in, they didn't have a job, they now have a job, that is an increase of more than 10% of earned income. If your written policy and procedure reflects HOTMA's requirement, and you don't elect to do something more additional than that, then you would just document the file that they reported it to you, and you put in the file a note to file that hey, they told you I have a job, but per our written policy and procedure, we do not process interim recertifications for increases in earned income. Stick it in the file. You're good to go.
Okay. All right. And the last one starts with the increase for income. Amy's going to take it from here. Thank you, guys. See you next time.
Bye.
Okay, the next question is, the increase for income would be effective at the start of the new recert rather when the resident actually started working.
Yes, so if you have an increase of more than 10% due to earned income, okay, that HUD is telling you wait until annual recertification to process. So what will happen is, once you go through your annual recertification process, you will then see again that they have that job, and you would process the job, and you would change an adjustment to their annual adjusted income, which would change their rent at annual recertification, but not before that. Did that get us caught up?
That is all. Yep,
Excellent.
that's all.
Thank you, Amy. All right, let's keep on keeping on. So let's talk about scenario A. So increases in adjusted income. So the Martinez family's annual reexamination is due in November. And remember, they wrote this notice back in 2023 for 2024. So we're just going to kind of focus on the November date. The family no longer has childcare expenses for their 3 children, and the family stopped paying for daycare back in August. And they reported the change and certified that there were no other changes to the annual income or expenses. So on September 7th, you, the owner, resulted an estimated 5% increase in the family's annual adjusted income. Although the 15% is well above the 10% threshold, the owner does not process the interim recertification because they have a policy not to process changes reported within the last 3 months of the next annual recertification. So because they came in at August 31st, that is within the last 3 months of their certificate of the year. So that's within 3 months of the annual recertification. And as a result, because it was in the written policy and procedure, you would document that the family came in and reported this information, but you would say, here's a cover sheet or a note to file, or that HUD form that we talked about earlier, where it says, hey, this didn't meet the threshold, or this is our policy and it doesn't meet the threshold, because we have a policy that says it's not going to do it because it's the last 3 months. Scenario B, the Allen family has had an annual adjusted income of $29,000 as of their last annual re-examination or recertification, which was effective May 1st. The family experiences the following changes to income and household composition since that May 1st annual recertification. In July, The Allen's family eldest child, Christina Allen, who's 20 years of age, started going to college full-time on a Pell Grant. Christina is not employed, nor does she receive any other type of student financial assistance. The family now qualifies for a $480 dependent deduction because she has been verified as a full-time student, which full-time students who are in the household under this example would be considered a dependent. So it says 480 because that's what the dependent deduction was back in 2014. Keep in mind, it's going to be going up to 500 in 2026. The family also reported Christina's student status to the owner, which noted the change in the family's file, and the owner is not allowed to perform an interim recertification because the dependent deduction represents a 1.7% decrease in the family's annual adjusted income, and the owner did not establish a threshold lower than the 10% decrease in income. So if in your property, if your policy is also matching that, where you're just following the minimum, that this would not trigger it. So you would document what has happened, but you wouldn't actually pull the trigger and execute a 5059. Later in October, the family added an adult family member, Tom Smith, to the household. The new adult family member receives a pension of $275 a month or $3,300 annually. So they have unearned income that they are bringing into the household. The owner determines that the family member's new annual adjusted income is now $31,820, accounting for both the addition of Tom's pension income, who's the new household member, and the deduction of the full-time student dependent allowed for Christina, who, remember, in July, earlier in the year, she did become a full-time student, which caused her to be a dependent, which increased the dependence allowances, which would increase the adjusted income. So the family member's annual adjusted income of a total of $2,820 or 9.7%. Since this decrease is below the 10% threshold, the owner will not conduct an interim recertification. Instead, they will process a non-interim transaction or other non-interim recertification to add Tom to the family without changing the family's annual adjusted income in October. So remember, in this scenario, what we are saying is that this is an increase in adjusted income. So what first happened was in July, we have an increase in deduction, but that is such a small amount. It's 1.7. It doesn't trigger an interim recertification. And then later in October, we have someone who is added to the household, but their unearned income still is not enough to change an increase in adjusted income so that it didn't actually trigger the interim recertification when you took all factors into consideration. So earlier in the year, you would document that the July didn't meet the trigger, and then you would, when in October they reported it again, you would re-examine it all cumulatively together, and that still wasn't enough to meet the trigger of a 10% threshold. So you don't have to process a normal, regular, old-fashioned interim recertification. But in this example, they're alluding to that there is now an other non-interim recertification, which one of the reasons why you would conduct that is because you've had a household member that has been added. And so we'll talk about that in a little while. Scenario C. So in this example, the Wynn family's last annual recertification was in April, and in June, so a couple of months later, Patrick Wynn lost his job, and the family's adjusted income fell from $25,000 to $13,000. So the decrease in earned income was due to him losing his job. You, as the property, conduct an interim reexamination for the decrease in income because it met the threshold. Remember, decreases of earned income are considered, it's the increases of earned income that wait to annual recertification. In November, Kelly Wynn finds a job and the family's adjusted income rises to $18,000. So in most housing partners' written policies and procedures, what I would expect to see is that you would process the interim recertification if it meets the threshold for the losing of the job. But if your written policy and procedure says you do not process it for earned income increases of more than 10%, then that's where you would stop. You wouldn't conduct an interim recertification when Kelly found a job and the income, the annual adjusted income increases because now she has more earned income. However, in this example, the owner of the property has elected to has taken an additional election, and they say that they do consider increases in earned income when an interim examination has been performed for a decrease in earned income. So remember, when I was talking earlier, it is a very specific trigger that causes an owner who has elected this option to do it. There must be, between those annual recertifications, prior to the increase of earned income, there must be a decrease of unearned income, very specifically. If you don't elect to do that policy where you process any increases in earned income, even if it's over 10%, then you didn't have to do anything. But this property, this owner in this property has elected to go ahead and do that. And since the family adjusted income now increases by more than 10% when including that, because they had that previous deduction, you're going to process a second interim recertification for that increase. So this is an example of how, if you elect to do this, where you are saying, hey, we are going to consider earned income increases, then you have to follow the policy and you have to do it. If your policy expressly says, no, we are not processing earned income of 10%, then we're not going to do it. But if you do say you're going to do it, it has to be this very specific example. Let's talk about another scenario. The Mossberg family had an annual adjusted income of $35,909 based on earned income and 2 dependent deductions. As of the last annual recertification in June, the family experiences the following changes since their June annual recertification. In August, Libby reported she received a raise at work, increasing her annual earned income by $2,650. She also recently started receiving monthly child support payments of $150 or $18,000 annually. She reported no other changes to the owner. While the combined increase of earned income, which is their wages, and the unearned income child support is 12.3% in annual adjusted income since their annual recertification in June, the owner looks at the earned and unearned income changes independently to determine if the interim recertification should be performed. Remember, if your policy says, if HUD is saying that if it is due to earned income, you don't process an interim recertification. So we kind of have a mixed example of where we've had an increase due to both unearned and earned income. You've got to look at those separately. You would process them at the same time, but when you're thinking about whether or not it meets the threshold, your policy needs to state and the file needs to document that, hey, we looked at the calculation of what the 10% threshold would be, and it doesn't meet it because we don't process earned income, but we do process unearned income. So the earned income is about a 7% increase and the unearned is about a 5%. And even though that totaled 12.3% together, you don't consider the earned income of 7% and you would only have the 5%. So the owner documents in the tenant file the family reported changes, but an interim recertification was not performed because the 5% increase in annual adjusted income based on the unearned income does not meet the 10% threshold. The owner may not perform an interim recertification for Livy's 7% increase based on earned income because an interim recertification for income decreases during the re-examination cycle was not completed and it does not meet the 10% threshold to cause the interim. So what they're saying is basically what I talked about, which is that you processing them at the same time, but you're looking at the unearned income separately from the earned income to see if it meets the threshold. And that's the numbers that you are comparing. Even if Libby's change in earned income had exceeded 10% of her annual income, the owner may not perform an interim recertification because there was no prior interim reexamination for a decrease. So remember, if you elect that very specific scenario where you have those 2 annual recertifications and there is a more than 10% decrease in earned income earlier in the year, now, in this example, if there is an increase of more than 10%, if the owner elects that, that would be allowed. But this note is saying that even if you elected that policy, you still wouldn't be able to process it because it didn't meet the threshold. So later in the year, in November, Libby reports that her monthly child support payments increased again from $150 to $325 per month. She certified that you screen her and there was no other changes to income or deductions. So Libby's annual unearned income from child support of $3,900 is now a change of more than 10.8% increase to that annual adjusted income, based on what was done compared to June's annual recertification. So because the threshold of more than 10% increase, which this is unearned income, you would be required to process an interim recertification. So you would process it just because of the unearned income. Now you will continue to disregard the increase in earned income. So again, like we said earlier, and how people were clarifying earlier, is you're going to wait until the annual recertification before you would consider the earned income change. You still have to screen them, you still need to document, and you need to explain why, based on your written policies procedures, you have not processed the earned income, but you processed the unearned income. But when a tenant, you're explaining this to the tenant, you need to just say, hey, this is the written policy and procedure. This is HUD's new way of doing this. We will consider your increase. Now, I don't know why they would push back on this, because basically they would be paying more rent. So, you know, that might be a great way of explaining it to a tenant. And if you are a tenant, it doesn't benefit you to have the earned income considered for an interim recertification. It benefits you to wait to the annual recertification, because your rent won't increase for that earned income increase. Amy, are there any questions? Because we've had some detailed examples.
Yes, there are a couple questions.
Okay.
The first one is, what if unearned income goes down, but not by 10%, and the resident is insisting you still do the interim? Should we?
So the question is if you have a unearned income and the decrease is less than 10%, and your written policy and procedure is not to process it post HOTMA, because HOTMA has been implemented and that is your written policy procedure, but you have the tenant who's insisting that you still have to do it, you hand them your written policy and procedure and you say, that is not how HUD does it anymore. And this is our written policy and procedure, and we are not required to process that interim recertification. And then they file a complaint with our agency, and I would ask you to provide the documentation that demonstrated that they did not meet the threshold to process the interim recertification. So again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for you to document not just the interim recertifications that are successful, but the ones that are not successful, because I would ask you for your written policies and procedures and the documentation for that interim recertification. And then I would review it and tell the tenant they are correct under HUD's HOTMA guidance, and per their written policy and procedure, they are not required to process an interim recertification. Any other questions?
Yes, the next one is, so someone can move in today with zero income and we pay them a UA check. Then they get a job. Now we don't have to increase their rent when we will continue to give them that UA check each month?
Yes. Yes. So HUD is saying that for earned income, they do not want those considered prior to the annual recertification. So the only example is if you elect that your written policy and procedure, you choose to go above and beyond, where you have that specific policy that says if they process in between the annual recertifications, they process a decrease of earned income, later in the year they have an increase that meets the threshold, both thresholds are met, then you can process an interim recertification. But that is the specific example. So no other example is permitted or allowed under the program. So in your example, they move in, you're giving them a utility reimbursement, and 3 months in, they get a job, you're going to wait until the annual recertification to process that change in earned income. If you become aware of it, you do need to process it. You need to do an application. You do need to verify. Then you need to document why you didn't meet the threshold. But if it's earned income, you don't even have to get to that. If it's unearned income, you got to do the process. But if it's earned income, you simply need to document the file that they came in and it told you, hey, I've had a job and it's earned income, but I've had no other changes. You can document the file, have them fill out an application, and then document the file and say, hey, it's the only change has been earned income. We're not processing per our written policy procedure. Any other questions?
Yes. So we wait for the increase in income until annual research. Only if it's within 90 days of the research or wait period at the annual research.
So there are increases, and there's increases for earned income, and there are increases for unearned income. Increases at all, decreases or increases at all, if it happens within the last 3 months prior to the due date of their annual recertification, if it is in your written policy procedure not to process it, you don't have to process it. That it's up or down, any change within the last 3 months, if it's in your written policy and procedure, you don't have to process the interim recertification. If it is unearned income, if it is any decrease of more than 10%, earned income, unearned income, you do have to process it if it's more than 10%. So that's earned, unearned. The increase, you only process it if it meets the 10% threshold, if it is unearned income. If it's an increase of earned income, you don't take that into consideration, but you do document the file that you're aware of it. And the reason why you have to document that they did report to you earned income, even though you're not processing an interim recertification, is because when we talk about annual recertifications next week, you have to look at that to determine if you have to calculate earned income for the next 12 months. So the trade-off is, yeah, we're waiting to annual recertifications to do earned income, but what that means is when you do your annual recertification, you're looking back at all the times they told you, even if it didn't trigger an interim recertification, because if they have a pattern of having jobs, you have to calculate earned income projected forward if you think that they're going to actually have a job, even if they don't currently have one. So that's next week. Don't get too scared about that. We'll talk about that in depth, but that is correct. So Amy, are there any other questions?
Oh, yes. What if someone is not working at annual recertification and 3 months later reports a new job earning $20,000? Do we still wait 9 months later to add that to an annual recertification?
Yes. So if they have an increase of earned income of more than of any amount, including over 10%, you would wait until the annual recertification to calculate that. And I know that absolutely sounds bananas, but the way that annual recertifications changes, the way you catch it is that annual recertification looking back. So yeah, you may have a tenant who likes to start and stop jobs, but those annual recertifications, any change in earned income is going to be captured at annual recertification and will be considered for the next 12 months. So yeah, think about it this way. I know we're just starting this process for the first time, but if you do annual recertifications and you look back and you potentially consider it for the next 12 months, you don't have to consider it for an interim because you did it at the last annual recertification. So if we've been doing this for a few years, you've already considered whether or not they take jobs throughout the year because you did that at annual recertification. So again, we'll talk about that next week. Amy, let me make sure there's no other examples because maybe that will answer some people's questions, but then we'll circle back. Is that okay?
Yeah, however you want to do it. I'll just keep these questions in the ticker until you're ready to move to the next one.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I guess we don't. Sorry. So Amy, do we have more questions? Sorry about that. I I thought we
That's
had
okay.
another.
What is the point of running EIV if they don't recertify if additional income is found? This is confusing.
So the HUD has said, if you attended last week's training on 811 HOTMA, and if you haven't, I recommend that you check it out, is that EIV does not happen at interim recertifications. So HUD did solicit feedback and got feedback that running EIV at interim recertifications makes no sense whatsoever. Interim recertifications are about things that are happening between annual recertifications, and the information oftentimes is more than 3 months old. So it doesn't help you to consider EIV in an income report in between there. That's not to say that you don't run your new hires reports separately. So you have reports that are run based on the tenant, and you have ones that are binder level, which are property wide. Those new hires you still need to consider to see if you do need to do an interim. The income and the income report, income discrepancy report, you're not looking at any longer during interim. And that's basically what you're saying is, why are we looking at these reports if it's not really helpful? And HUD is saying you're no longer looking at an EIV report to see if it triggers the certification. Now, the new hires report it's going to be weird because you're still required to run that quarterly. But what's going to happen is you're going to see, hey, I have a discrepancy, and it's because they have a job. You're going to document the file saying, hey, the new hires report showed that they started a job in between their annual recertification on this date, and you're going to keep a copy of that detailed report and your explanation in the tenant file, because when you do your annual recertification, you're looking at that report. So you're going to look at all of those new hires reports when you look at your annual recertification. Are there other questions?
Yes.
Okay.
If the resident has a job, but at the time of recert does not have the job anymore, what do we do?
We'll talk about that next week. And I don't want to talk about it today because I don't want you to get confused with interims today. So I apologize, but we will definitely address that next week.
Okay, good. Is there any protections to prevent Section 811 residents from quitting jobs right before annual recerts and then getting new jobs directly after?
Yes. So when we talk about annual recertifications next week, the new process is designed. We don't look at them at interim, so we can capture them at annual recertification. So the new process is not only, bananas showing you not to consider earned income for interims, but you are doing a little bit of extra work at annual recertifications, looking back at your new hires reports, looking at any time they told you there was a change and you documented and it didn't result in an interim certification. So like I said earlier, even if they come in and report they've had a change in earned income, screen them, document, say, hey, we didn't process this because this is an earned income and our written policy procedure doesn't require us to do that. Keep that in the file, because when you look at annual recertifications, we talk about it next week, you would look at that and you would look at the three-step process to determine whether or not you would consider that. So again, more about that next week. Definitely come. Any other questions?
When does this go into effect as far as income interims?
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently, as we talked about last week, is that HUD's latest notice indicates that HOTMA goes into effect for the 811 PRA program on January 1st of 2026. For all our other multifamily programs monitored by the department, such as tax credit, home, bond, any of those already went into effect January 1st of 2024. They have not gone into effect for 811 PRA because HUD has not finalized the documents needed, which would be necessary to update their system so you could submit this documentation without any problems. And because of that, we are waiting for HUD to get those systems and forms finalized so that your partner, your software partner that helps you generate the 5059s, 5059As, they can update their system so that they can transmit through tracks the information, so that you can report that. Now, HUD says January 1st of 2026, but HUD may push that back. And like I said last week, is that if HUD does publish a notice that says that they are pushing this back, which may be possible because of the government shutdown, the federal government shutdown, we may end up having that date pushed back. I have no way of knowing what HUD is going to do. They're much more closer than they have in the past to finalizing this and getting it done. So they may still say, let's rush this through to get the forms done. You need to start implementing this, or they may delay it. So that's the long answer. The short answer is it's on track to be January 1st of 2026. Pre-HOTMA before that, post-HOTMA for any certifications. And it's not when you're doing the certification, it's the effective date of the certification. So any certifications due after January 1st of 2026 would be required to do post-HOTMA. If that changes, we will send out a listserv. So make sure you are signed up for our email listserv, and we will send you out letting you know and give you information on that notice to let you know. Amy, any other questions?
Yes. When a resident is in the 811 PRA program and they don't pay their rent, can we send them a notice to vacate?
Yes. So if a tenant who is participating in the 811 PRA program is not paying their rent, that is a violation of their lease contract. And that is not in compliance with the program. They are not in compliance with the program. And so what you should be doing is the 811 administration division. So I'm in compliance division, compliance monitoring specifically. We monitor for compliance and what we're talking about today. But there is at the department, the 811 administration division, and they administer the program. They're the ones processing your rental assistance payments. But some of the other things they do is like they work through the wait list. But another thing that they also do is if you deny an applicant or you are terminating tenancy or assistance. So you're terminating tenancy, which means you're kicking them out of the property, or you're terminating assistance, which means they can stay there, but they're not going to get any rental assistance. You must send the notice to the 811 administration division at their 811info at tdhca.texas.gov email address. You must send it to them 3 days in advance before you send it to the tenant. And in there, you would explain that they are not paying their rent, provide documentation to evidence that, such as a ledger, and they will review your notice to make sure it complies with program requirements. That is for your benefit as much as the tenant's benefit, because if there's something wrong, they'll have you reissue it so that you can definitely let them know that they are going to be potentially evicted if they do not pay their rent. And so they would then process that, tell you, hey, you're good to go ahead and send it. You would send it to the tenant, and then you would proceed with your process of evicting them for non-payment of rent. So yes, you absolutely can have a tenant move out for non-payment of rent. Now, I do want to point out, we have some housing partners who have chosen to not do that for a year or so on some of our tenants, and they have a running balance. If that is the case, it is most likely the 811 administration is going to recommend that you do a payment plan with them to get them caught up prior to trying to just kick them out for non-payment of rent. And that is actually a benefit to our housing partners, because when you go to a judge to say, hey, you know, they didn't pay their rent for a year, we were trying to help them, they kept saying they were going to be able to, they didn't, we entered into a repayment agreement, they made the first one, but then they never paid the second one. This is why we're back here. We're filing for eviction. They owe us a lot of money. That will help solidify your claim that they didn't pay their rent. So it's actually a better documentation to make sure your thing. And if you are a tenant and you get a repayment agreement, this is a second chance that you potentially have to get to get you caught up. So are there any other questions, Amy?
Yes. What about the new hires report? Since working income is no longer what makes us do an interim, why are we looking at it?
Yeah, so we are looking at the new hires reports because you would see if you run a new hires report like you do every 3 months, and there is no discrepancy. There's nothing that indicates that there's a discrepancy between what you reported on everyone's 5059s regarding employment. Then you just save those reports and there's no discrepancy. But if you have a discrepancy, you would have in the master binder the main level, the higher level report that shows that who are the tenants that have a discrepancy, and then you would have either attached or on that report you would say, hey, we've addressed the discrepancy and they don't have a job, or they do have a job. In the tenant file, you would have the detailed new hires report and the documentation necessary to show what was actually going on. And under the new post-HOTMA requirements, you're documenting that in the tenant file, not because you're doing interim recertifications, but when we talk about what we're going to talk about next week is you would look at that when you do an annual recertification. So this is the new hires is more about documenting throughout the year for your annual recertification. Was there enough documentation to indicate that, well, maybe they don't have a job now, but based on their new hires report and their current income report that I ran for annual recertification, but not for the interims, they've had jobs throughout the year. So that might have to be considered when you determine what their rent is going to be for the next year. And again, we'll talk about that next week. Any other questions?
Nope, that got us all caught up.
Yes. Okay. Let's talk about, these are great questions. I wanted to make sure that we broke up HOTMA into 3 parts because some of these concepts are just like, what? Are you crazy? I'm not considering earned income for interims. Like that is the #1 thing that causes interims. So yeah, I hear you, I understand. But remember, one of the primary goals for HOTMA is to decrease the administrative burden for you and for the family. Yes, you still need to document the file, which is more of a burden than if they just let it go, but that's because the annual recertification is catching it on the back end. Okay, let's talk about other non-interim recertifications. So we have mostly been focusing on interim recertifications. So that's where you have met a threshold of less than 10% for earned and unearned income, and for increases in unearned income of more than 10%. That is what triggers an interim recertification. And that random example where you had someone who permanently moved out or died and they had that one change. Other non-interim recertifications is a new type of certification. If an interim recertification is not triggered, but it meets the criteria for other non-interim, you are going to do this new type of certification, which is called an other non-interim recertification. It is reported on a HUD 5059, and so you would screen the household if they say they've had a change in family size, or they've had some type of change. Someone has passed away. You would need to screen them to make sure there's no other changes, because remember, HOTMA says it's not just what they told you, but any changes that they have. So you're going to screen them. And if you screen them and that the only change is that they've had a change in the family size, you would do another non-interim recertification on a 5059. And so the new forms, if you go to HUD's website, you can see the proposed forms. I'm not sharing them with you just because I don't want you to think they're finalized and start to give them to tenants. But if you are proactive enough and you go to HUD's HOTMA forms, the 5059 and its instructions do not talk about the other non-interim recertification. I believe it's OR is the new abbreviation. So instead of IR, it would be an OR. So you're going to conduct these if there is a decrease in family size attributed to the death or permanent move out of the family member since the last recertification, and removing that would result in an increase in annual adjusted income. So that's bringing forward from what we talked about earlier. Other non-interim recertifications is where they remove the family member but does not result in any changes in the family's annual adjusted income. So we're tabling the change in income till later, until the next recertification to consider the increase. So what causes an other non-interim recertification? So if you are adding or removing a hardship exemption for childcare expense deduction. So last week we talked about some of the major changes to HOTMA that impacted the program. And one of them is that there are hardship exemptions where in the first year in 2026, instead of going straight to the 10% threshold, you're first going to go to 5%. And then the next year, going to 7.5. And in year 3, you would go to the 10%. If you are removing your hardship exemption, so let's say because of that change, the tenant comes into you and says, hey, I have a hardship because you're doing this increase. I need a hardship exemption. If they say that whatever caused that request for the exemption no longer exists, or you find out that it doesn't exist anymore, on a other non-interim recertification, you would report that exemption is no longer required, and that would change what their rent is. Updating or removing the phased-in hardship relief. So this is over time, you are going from that 5 to 7.5 to 10%. If they're asking for relief under there because they've had some circumstance that if you remove this, if you do the increase, it's going to cause an extreme hardship, which might cause them not to be able to pay rent or afford food or some extreme thing. If you have a change in the circumstances and it is removing or you're adding that hardship, you would report it on another non-interim recertification. If the tenant elects to do, instead of the phased-in relief, you're going through the phased-in relief and they proactively say, hey, I'd rather do the general hardship relief, which is, hey, you have in your written policies and procedures the criteria that triggers this hardship exemption. It lasts for 90 days. You can extend it if your policy permits for another 90 days. The circumstances must still be in place during those extensions. Once it goes away, you would remove that. So you would report when they have the hardship exemption and when it goes away on another non-interim recertification. So in theory, they come in, they say, hey, I'm doing the phased-in relief, but I've had a huge extreme circumstance that if you take away my reasonable attendant care deduction that I no longer qualify, if you take it away, I won't be able to pay rent. You say, okay, got it. Let's do a general hardship. They do the hardship. It follows your policies and procedures. You then would report on the other non-interim recertification the date it goes in, and the effective date on that. Keep in mind, they get 90 days of that. Now you can extend it for another 90 days, but you need to document the file why you extended it and did it meet your policy and procedure, and did the reason for the hardship continue. But then also what you will do is once it goes out, either at the end of the 90 days or at the end of the next 90-day period, or in between, you would then have to file another non-interim recertification to report it was added and it was removed. If you're adding or removing non-family members, so household members, so people who are not part of the family but are part of the household, such as live-in aides, foster children, or foster adults, you would do an other non-interim recertification. You also do it if you're adding a family member and the increase in adjusted income does not trigger an interim recertification. So if you have someone who moves in and it causes the adjusted annual increase to income, you're going to do an other non-interim recertification to say, hey, this didn't trigger an interim recertification, but we are letting you know, HUD, that there is a new person living there. It also can happen when you have a family member who you're moving out of the household and there is an increase in adjusted income, and that also doesn't trigger an interim recertification. So if it doesn't meet the threshold to cause the interim, you're going to file an other non-interim recertification to let HUD know, hey, they moved out, but it didn't meet the threshold. So you don't have to do an other and an interim recertification. You only do it when it meets one of the criteria. Lastly, if you are adding or updating a family or a household member's social security number. So let's say, for example, you have a baby that is just born. They have a number of months to get you that documentation. Once the kid has the social security number, they bring it in. You put it in the file. Once you have an EIV report to confirm that it's correct, you can get rid of that documentation to verify. But as soon as you are aware of what the new Social Security number is, they give you the information. You need to conduct another non-interim recertification. And the reason for that is so it can show up in your EIV reports. So when you run your summary report at annual recertification, you will see that number is verified, and you can delete the baby Social Security number. Do we have any questions before we move on to the effective dates for interim recertifications, Amy?
Nope, no new questions.
Okay, excellent. Again, HOTMA talks about how the timely processing of recertifications is approximately 30 days. Approximately 30 days does not mean 90 days. It means approximately 30 days. And the approximately is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. So this is a new process. We are going to be giving you guys lots of grace on this. Like I said earlier in the training, that we are going to start providing you technical assistance if your interim recertifications are not being processed timely. It is very important that you do these within 30 days because it impacts the tenant's rent. And when we talk about when these go into effect, you'll see that if you take too long to process it, you then end up causing it where the tenant would pay an extra amount of rent that they probably shouldn't have if you were not more timely. And so it's very important to be very timely with your interim and other non-interim recertifications. The interim, because it's going to change the rent. Their other non-interim, because you may be reporting something that may result in something that impacts an EIV report that you would need to see that would be considered at annual recertification. So for changes reported timely by the family, so you have a written policy and procedure, you are giving them at annual recertification, I recommend you give them a copy of the policy and procedure. Remember, you are giving them updated fact sheets and the handouts, the EIV and U, and all of those things that you normally do at annual recertification. You're going to give them all of those three during this new process once HOTMA goes into effect. And when you're doing that, it is probably a good idea to give them a copy of the post HOTMA. You were required in earlier in this year to have both your pre and your post HOTMA certifications running concurrently together until HOTMA goes into effect. And if they want to look at that in advance, they can come in and ask for your post HOTMA. I do recommend that you do give them the post HOTMA policy when you begin the process for HOTMA so that they can understand, because some people have been on assistance for a while. Your target population is disabled. They may have always been on some type of Section 8 assistance. So this is a major change to them. And so if you are not getting ahead of it, and like we talked about last week, it is the owner's responsibility to effectively communicate these new processes. It is very important that you take every opportunity to say to them, hey, this is a new process. It's big. Hey, here it is. Read it out. Let me know if you have any questions. So if the family reads your policy and procedure, they know what to do, they are executing the new HUD model lease, they are now going to be aware of what those changes are going to be. If they timely report to you an increase which causes, if they report something to you timely and it causes an increase in tenant rent, it goes into effect the first day of the month after a 30-day advance notice. So that is not changing. So any increases in tenant rent require a 30-day advance notice. And so you give them the notice, you count 30 days later, and then you round up to the next first. It is never in the middle of a month. It's always the first of the month that the changes occur. And so if you give them a 30-day notice, and keep in mind, there are some months that have 31 days. So if you give them on the first, it may not be satisfied and you may have to wait till the next month. So be careful of that. You don't get to round down or round up to 31. It's 30 days exactly. So give the notice, count 30 days, and then round up to the next first of the month. So that is if there is an increase in tenant rent and they came in and they told you and they followed the policy and procedure and the program requirements. If there is a decrease in tenant rent, it goes into effect the first day of the month after the date the actual change led to the interim recertification. So we're going retroactively backwards. So they timely reporting to you a change. So there is a decrease in earned or unearned income, or there is an increase in earned income. This is what it's talking about. And so if there is a decrease in tenant rent, then it would go back to the first day of the month after the change occurred. So if we had a situation where they lost a job and they lost a portion of their child support, what you would do is, if that happened and they reported it to you at the beginning of October, you process it in October, you can implement it November 1st. Now, if you got the information in September and it took you to process it through October, you would still go back to October 1st after the actual change that occurred in September. So you are rewarding them for being correctly telling you when these changes occur. So this is that requirement. If the family does not report timely the changes and there is an increase in tenant rent, it goes into effect the first day of the month after the date the actual change led to the interim recertification. So for example, if you have a family and they had a more than 10% increase in child support and they did not report it to you in a timely manner, then as a result, they would have had an interim recertification that was required to be conducted because they met the 10% increase threshold. Their tenant rent would go up. You are no longer waiting the 30 days before you implement it. You are going retroactively to the first day of the month after the change occurred. This only applies if they fail to timely report. I highly recommend for all of this that you document when you have been notified of a change, because I can tell you when I review complaints, they are 100% documenting all of this information. So it is very important that your on-site staff documents a tenant file when they received this change. And the best way to do that, again, is your policy should probably say, fill out an application or questionnaire. And that date is when you say, hey, come in, it's our policy, you need to fill out this form so we can get the process started. The date of that application will probably help you in this scenario. So again, if they fail to report timely and it's an increase in tenant rent, you are no longer waiting 30 days. It is the retroactive of the first day of the month after that change has occurred. Okay, that's not a huge change, but it is solidifying that they are penalized for failing to report timely. If there is a decrease in tenant rent, they fail to report it timely, now there's a decrease in tenant rent. These are less common because they tend to be on the ball with that, is that it goes into effect the first day of the month after you complete the interim recertification. So they are being penalized by not telling you in advance. You don't have to go backwards and do it retroactively. So the penalty for failing to tell you of a decrease is you don't go back in time, you go forward in time, and the change happens the first day of the month after you complete your recertification. Now, don't forget, you have to complete this within approximately 30 days. So this can't go for more than a month or so. But you need to make sure that the tenant understands in their written policy and procedure that you give them that if they fail to report something timely, there is actual penalties for that. If they have an increase in tenant rent, it's retroactive. If it's a decrease in tenant rent, it's not going to go into effect until after you process it within approximately 30 days. HUD allows through HOTMA for you to establish an election, an added extra thing. It is not required, but you may establish in your written policies and procedures that you will apply retroactively decreases in tenant rent, even if they fail to report timely. This is an optional thing. Your policy needs to state what you are doing one way or the other, because it is necessary so that if we get a complaint or the tenant doesn't understand, you can hand them the policy and they understand that you do the first two things. So if you say you do those first two things in your written policy and procedure, you don't have to say we don't retroactively. You've already stated what your policy is. But if you choose to take this extra additional step where you are saying, yes, you didn't report it timely and you had a decrease, we're going to go ahead and give it to you. If your policy states that because you've elected to do so, then your policy needs to state that and you need to follow through. So you need to explain the criteria that is met to trigger that. So if you want it to be broad, that's fine. You do it in every scenario. If it's only under certain circumstances, that's fine. I recommend being very careful with setting up your criteria, that you are not setting up criteria that would in some way determine that you are discriminating. So for example, I wouldn't set up a criteria that says, well, we do this for decreases in job, but we don't do it for decreases in unearned income, because the implication there is that if you deny them that because they've had a change in child support, but they didn't, and you did it because of a job but not child support, that could be potentially a familiar status issue. So be very careful in your criteria. I would probably recommend one of the cases where you're probably a little more broad in your criteria for this, and maybe just do it for everyone or not at all. The caveat on this is that if you elect to do this, is that HUD is saying you absolutely cannot go further back than the first day of the month after the change occurred. So again, you don't have to do this, but if you are going to do it, you can't go past the time which triggered the event. Okay, let's go through some examples. Hopefully these will answer some of your questions that you have, and then after these examples, I'll circle back to Amy to see if there's any other questions. So scenario A. The Miller family had a decrease in family income that met the threshold due to the loss of a job in June. They reported the decrease to you in accordance with your policies on June 15th. So they had it happen on June 2nd. On June 15th, maybe a week or two later, they realized, hey, I don't have a job, I need to tell you. They followed your policy and procedure that says you need to tell them within a certain timeline, like 30 days. The interim research examination would be effective July 1st of 2024 because they timely reported it to you. It is always going to be the first day of the month after it went into effect if they timely are reporting. Scenario B, the Leon family has an increase of 10% or more in annual adjusted income on June 1st due to receiving a new type of benefit. So this is unearned income. The increased income meets the threshold to require an interim. They reported the increase to the PHA, they reported it to the owner in accordance with their local policies on June 20th. So it happened on June 1st and they told you on June 20th. So that's pretty quick. That should be within your policies and procedures. But you had some delay and you were unable to process it until July 11th. So you were trying to get verifications and it took you a little while, and so you didn't be able to finish it until July 11th. So the effective date of the interim re-examination is going to be 9/1 to give the family time, a 30-day advance notice of a tenant increase. So in this example, they have an increase of an annual adjusted income. It's going to increase its unearned income. It's going to meet the threshold. It's going to increase their tenant rent. This example is to show you that once you've processed the certification, you still have to give them a 30-day advance notice. So even though they timely reported, you finished it on 7/11, you give them the 30-day notice, which would be 7/11, you would give it to them, it would be 8/11, which means you would round up to September 1st, giving them the 30 days plus to the 1st. Scenario C, the Wen family had a family member join the household, thereby increasing the annual adjusted income by 10% or more due to the new member's Social Security income starting on August 1st. The increased income meets the threshold to require an interim. However, the change in income was not reported to you until September 15th. So it happened on August 1st, and they waited a month and a half to tell you, and you have a policy to tell them within 30 days. And in general, I think that's what most people's policy should be, is that they need to tell you within 30 days, because that aligns with all the other things that HUD requires you. Because the family failed to alert you of the increase in income in accordance with your policy, the increased income is effective retroactively to September 1st, the first of the month following the date of the income change. So HOTMA is saying, hey, if the Wynn family had told you timely, within 30 days to, hey, we have a new person and they have unearned income that's increasing by more than 10%, your effective date of your interim recertification is retroactive to the first day of the month after it happened. And since what happened on August 1st, even though you process the interim recertification after they tell you on September 15th, because it happened in August and they failed to timely report it to you, it retroactively applies September 1st of 2024. The reason why HUD is setting this stuff up is to discourage families from failing to report timely. Scenario D, the Husseini family's current and annual reexamination is effective on February 1st. So they have an annual recertification that's due every year on February 1st. A member of the Husseini's family lost their job on January 2nd, so right before the annual recertification, but the family failed to report the change until April 5th, so after their annual recertification. So the change happened before the annual recertification, but they failed to do it until after the annual recertification. If your policy says that you allow for a retroactive rent decrease, even if they did not report timely, you can have it apply on March 1st, which is the first month after you have processed the recertification and you've applied it retroactively. Now, keep in mind that that is optional. So if they fail to report and it is your policy and you just do with what the minimum HUD requires, the base default for HUD, and it's in your written policy and procedure, what you would do is it would not go into effect until the first of the month after you finish processing it. So because what has happened is because they had a decrease that met the threshold, because they failed to timely report to you per your policy, if your policy says that you will not retroactively apply it, that means once you finish the process, since you were made aware on April 5th, you would not implement it until May 1st of the year. So that's if you go with the default. But if you have that policy where you say you want it to be retroactive, you can do that as well. So this is an example of how HUD is trying to reduce the administrative burden on housing partners. So in the past, what used to happen often is you would have to go back and process an interim recertification sometimes, and then do an annual recertification, and you would have to do a new interim, and you'd have to correct an annual recertification. HUD is saying that if they failed to timely report and you found out an EIV report, or they came in and they told you after the fact, if this is in your written policy and procedure, it will not go into effect until the first after you finish processing, because it's been a decrease. So this was decreased their tenant rent. So this, I think, would probably be an example that most housing partners would be excited for, because a lot of certifications out there get corrected because you find out something later on that causes that. But now, between the unearned only counting at annual recertification and this new effective being enforced, this should really cut down on corrected previous certifications. Okay, let's talk about this learning point. I don't think we need to do a poll. I don't really do a good job at them, and Amy, I know you're not a fan of it. So we're just gonna ask the question, what is considered a reasonable timeline to complete an interim recertification? So what is HOTMA saying? What is a reasonable timeline? Is it approximately 3 days? Is it approximately 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days? So what do you guys think? What is HUD saying is the reasonable timeline to complete an interim recertification? That means once you've been noticed, you complete the application, you've done the verifications, you execute a 5.9, or you document that it didn't meet the threshold and you save it in the file. Okay, so the answer to that is approximately 30 days. HUD is saying that it is definitely 30 days, and we are now beginning to provide technical assistance if you are not meeting that, because in the future, we eventually will start citing this as a finding. Okay, which of the following would trigger an interim recertification? Okay, so an interim recertification, not an other non-interim, but an interim recertification. Would a decrease of 12% of annual adjusted income trigger an interim recertification? Would a decrease of 3% of annual adjusted income trigger an interim recertification? Would an increase of 10% annual adjusted income due to earned income trigger an interim recertification? Or D, an increase of 3% of annual adjusted income due to unearned income? So which one of these? So the answer is A, decrease of more than 12% of the annual adjusted income. So remember, you have their annual adjusted income. They come in and they report either an increase or a decrease. If it's a decrease, it has to be more than 10% for earned and or unearned income. For an increase, you're only considering unearned income of more than 10%. So 12% decrease met the threshold of a 10% decrease of annual adjusted income. A decrease of 3% is not enough to meet the 10%. An increase of 10% would have met it, except for it is specifically an increase for earned income, which we don't consider at interim, we consider them at annual recertification. And the last one is an increase of 3% of annual adjusted income due to unearned income, although unearned income is considered, the increase of 3% does not meet the 10% threshold. Okay, Amy, I think I'm going to go through these, and then I think we're almost towards the end, and then we'll ask the questions there. So I'm just wanting to give you a heads up. Which of the following would trigger an other non-interim recertification? So we were talking about interim recertifications. Now we're talking about those new other non-interim recertifications. Would it be adding or removing general hardship relief? Would it be adding or removing non-family members? Would it be adding a family member and the increase in adjusted income does not trigger an interim recertification? So remember, we want to know which one would not trigger it. Removing a family member and the increase in adjusted income does not trigger an interim recertification. Or is it E? You're adding or updating a family or household member's shoe size. So which do you think is the thing that would not trigger an other non-interim recertification? I think most people probably would say it's E, and that is correct. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, but this is a new concept, and so I don't want to confuse you by asking you a question that might muddle it in your brain. So I want you to be very clear. If you want, you can take the slides that we have for other non-interim recertifications, you can keep it, or you can look at the instructions for other non-interim recertifications, or you can look at the handout we gave you for HUD's notice for this information. When can you retroactively apply a tenant rent increase? Is it when a family timely reports a change or when a family fails to timely report a change? Now, this question is going to assume that your policy is going to not elect an additional restriction or additional policy that says even if they fail to report timely, that you will give it to them. The default is going to be, and you must put in your policy, that you would make it effective based on HOTMA's guidance. So in this example, you can apply it when a family fails to timely report a change, but if you only do it as a written policy and procedure. So if I think I may have mixed that up in my explanation, but it is basically where you can do it if you elect your policy to allow it to happen if they fail to timely report, but it is the default where the family, if they timely report, they can get it retroactive. So it's if it's confusing, look at the slides and just keep that in mind, or put it in your written policy procedure and refer to your written policy and procedure. Once you start to do it over time, it'll become second nature to you. Okay, we actually got to the end of the training. So Amy, are there any other questions that we have? And then after that, or before you ask those, I just want to make sure everyone understands that this training was a little shorter, so we could spread it out. Next week is annual recertifications. If you've not already registered, please do so. Please come back next week so we can talk about annual recertification big stuff. And Amy, I'm so sorry. I'm definitely now ready for the questions.
Okay. Just let me get to where I need to be here. Okay. What is considered timely reporting by the family? How many days do they have to report changes?
So the question is, what is timely reporting? I would recommend approximately 30 days. That's what HUD is holding you to a standard, and so that is the most logical standard you have. If you increase the standard, then you're just causing a reward for failing to report timely. And if your period is too short, such as you give them 2 days or 3 days, that is not reasonable. And you need to be able to give them time, because what may end up happening is they may end up fixing this situation, and they come in and they report it to you. If they report it too early, what may end up happening is let's say, for example, they've had a decrease and then they lost a job, and they have earned income, they lost a job, but then they go out and get another job. It may not be, you may not have to process an interim recertification, because by the time they report it, there's actually no change because they just went from one job to another. So I would do approximately 30 days, but that's my 2 cents for it. Any other questions?
Yes. The next question is, hi, Justin. Could you please remind the group that all of the changes we are discussing are not relevant if HUD publishes the 8-11 HOTMA changes out further, for example, 1/1/2027? Our operating software has to be updated first, correct?
Yes, that is correct. So like we're talking a little bit about earlier and last week, is that the current notice is that HOTMA is supposed to go into effect January 1st of 2026. However, the federal government is shut down. They were in the middle of that process. They have not updated the forms, which means if they've not finalized those forms, you, our housing partners, have software partners, third-party partners that you are working with to get your software updated so that you can have the new 5059s, the new 5059As. And until those are finalized and made available, your software partners won't be able to update this stuff. So HUD does have to take that into consideration when they say, when is HOTMA supposed to go into effect for the 811 PRA program. And so it is on track to be January 1st of 2026, but nobody knows, and there's no way for me to give you any additional guidance because the federal government is currently shut down, and so I don't have anyone I can ask. There's nobody I can be like, hey, what are we thinking here? So it may be that they do push it back. Maybe they push it back to July 1st of 2025 or 6. It could be that they push it back to July 1st of 2027. We don't know. And like I said earlier, it's very important that you sign up for our listserv, because once that comes out, and I check on a weekly basis, if there is a change and they publish a notice that they're going to push it back, we are going to put out a listserv so that you are also aware in case you missed it in your own gathering of notices. Any other questions?
That was the last question.
Wow. Okay. Well, that was a good one to end on. Thank you. Thank you for reminding us that we had that. That was a good thing to remind. So we talked about the interim recertifications. This is new concept. I know it's a little crazy. You're like, wait a minute, are you sure? The takeaways I have for it is be timely in your processing, understand the differences between interim and other non-interim, and apply correctly the rents. Make sure all of this is in your policy. We are going to try to give you grace on this because this is a major change, but it is very important that you do your best to be accurate in this information because it really does affect the tenants, the family's tenant rent. So if you make a mistake, remember you can submit corrected 5059s, corrected 5059As. So if you make a mistake and you realize it, you can correct it. You want to do that in advance of when we're giving you notice. But don't forget, our Texas Administrative Code requires that you notify your tenants of any change in tenant rent or utility reimbursement, in addition to having them execute the certifications. So this has been in effect since January 1st of this year. You must notify them of any change. And the reason for that is because tenants are still confused on what their rent or utility reimbursement is. So you must give them a notice for that. I was trying to buy some time to see if anyone else has any questions. Amy, are there any other questions?
Nope, no other questions.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone for showing up today. We got to finish an hour early. I'm so excited. Thank you for participating. Please come next week. And that's it. So everyone have a great day. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Justin. Great job.
Thank you, Amy. Well, thank you, everybody. All right. I'm leaving in
Okay.
3, 2, 1. Bye.
Bye, everybody.